My name is Jake Morrison, and I'm just a temp at Meridian Solutions. At least, that's what everyone thinks. What they don't know is that I have a master's degree in organizational psychology from Northwestern, 3 years of HR experience at Fortune 500 companies, and a very specific reason for being here that goes far beyond paying bills. You see, I'm caught in what most people would consider an impossible situation. A love triangle with two incredible women who work at this very company. Sarah Chen from accounting and Michelle Rodriguez from marketing. Both brilliant, both beautiful, and both completely aware of our unconventional arrangement. We've talked about it openly, the three of us. Sarah and Michelle actually like each other, which is what makes this whole thing work. They've agreed to share my time and attention, as unconventional as it sounds. It's not something any of us planned, but sometimes life throws you curveballs that you never saw coming. Sarah is 28, with a background in forensic accounting and a sharp wit that can cut through corporate nonsense like a hot knife through butter. She has this way of tilting her head when she's analyzing a problem that makes my heart skip a beat. Michelle is 26, a marketing strategist with an MBA from UCLA and eyes that could stop traffic. When she gets excited about a campaign idea, her whole face lights up. The three of us discovered our connection during a company happy hour 3 months ago. What started as casual conversation turned into something deeper when we realized we had genuine chemistry together. Not just romantic chemistry, but intellectual and emotional compatibility that's rare to find with one person, let alone two. But there's one massive, career-threatening problem. My supervisor, Derek Chen, the operations manager, has made it crystal clear that office relationships are strictly forbidden for temporary workers. Not just discouraged, absolutely forbidden. He's already terminated 2 temps this quarter for what he called quote inappropriate workplace conduct unquote. Derek has this obsession with maintaining what he calls professional boundaries, but anyone who's worked here for more than 5 minutes knows it's really just a power trip. The man gets off on controlling people, especially people he considers beneath him in the corporate hierarchy. The thing is, Derek doesn't know about my background. He sees me as just another disposable temp worker, probably some college dropout who couldn't get a real job. Little does he know that my previous position was as senior HR analyst at Henderson Corporate Group, where I worked directly under Janet Morrison for 2.5 years. Janet Morrison, who happens to be Meridian Solutions' new chief financial officer. Janet started here just 6 weeks ago, and Derek has absolutely no idea that we have history. Professional history, family history, and a working relationship built on mutual respect and trust. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how this all started to unravel, and how Derek Chen made the biggest mistake of his professional career. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when Derek first noticed something was different. The autumn light was filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our open-concept office space, casting long shadows across the rows of desks where Meridian's 147 employees pretended to be busy with their morning routines. I was at my assigned workstation, a small desk in the temp workers section that Derek had strategically positioned so he could monitor all the contract employees from his glass-walled office. Sarah had stopped by to discuss some invoice discrepancies she'd found in the quarterly expense reports. We were laughing about something completely work-related, a ridiculous expense claim someone had submitted for a quote team-building exercise unquote at a strip club. But Derek's paranoid mind immediately went elsewhere. I could see him through his office window, leaning forward in his ergonomic chair, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses and staring at us with the intensity of a hawk watching field mice. His thin lips were pressed into that familiar disapproving line that his direct reports had learned to fear. Derek thinking to himself, something's not right here. Sarah Chen from accounting has been spending way too much time talking to the temp workers lately. Especially that Jake guy. Why would a senior accountant need to have extended conversations with someone who's just doing data entry? I need to keep a closer eye on this situation. Can't have temps getting ideas above their station. That afternoon, Derek called me into his office for what he probably thought was going to be an intimidating one-on-one meeting. The man loves his little power plays, and his office is set up like a psychological warfare zone. His massive mahogany desk is positioned so that visitors have to sit in these uncomfortably low chairs while he towers above them from his high-back leather executive chair. Everything about the setup is designed to make you feel small and powerless. The walls are covered with his various certificates and awards, most of them for things like quote employee management excellence unquote and quote operational efficiency leadership unquote. There's a bookshelf filled with business books he's probably never read, titles like quote The Art of Corporate Domination unquote and quote Maximizing Human Resources for Optimal Productivity unquote. Jake, Derek said, adjusting his glasses and trying to project an aura of intimidation, I wanted to take a few minutes to discuss professional boundaries with you. His voice had that condescending tone that middle managers use when they want to remind you exactly where you stand in the corporate food chain. I've heard it 1,000 times before, from supervisors who thought they could push me around because they didn't know who they were dealing with. Of course, Derek. What specifically is on your mind? I replied, keeping my voice neutral and professional. I've noticed that you've been having quite a few conversations with various female employees lately. Extended conversations that seem to go beyond the scope of your assigned duties. I want to remind you that as a temporary worker, you're here to perform specific tasks, not to socialize with permanent staff members. Derek leaned back in his chair, clearly expecting me to be intimidated by his authority figure routine. What he didn't realize is that I've dealt with dozens of Derek Chens in my career. Middle managers who use their small amount of power to compensate for their own insecurities and limitations. I kept my expression neutral, but inside I was already calculating my next moves. Derek was fishing for information, but he didn't have anything concrete yet. He was operating on suspicion and prejudice, not evidence. I understand your concern completely, I replied diplomatically. I'm just trying to collaborate effectively with all departments to ensure that my work meets the company's standards. If there are specific issues with my performance or productivity, I'm happy to address them. Derek's jaw tightened slightly. My diplomatic response had clearly frustrated him because it didn't give him the opening he was looking for to escalate the confrontation. Let me be more direct, Jake, Derek said, leaning forward and attempting to project menace. I've terminated temporary workers before for inappropriate workplace relationships. Don't think for 1 second that your position here is secure if you step out of line. I have zero tolerance for temps who think they can treat this office like their personal dating pool. The threat was clear and unambiguous. Derek was drawing battle lines, and he expected me to retreat in fear. What he didn't understand is that I've been fighting battles like this for years, and I've never lost one yet. I appreciate you clarifying the expectations, I said, standing up from the uncomfortable chair. Is there anything else you need to discuss? Derek waved his hand dismissively, clearly pleased with what he thought was a successful intimidation session. That's all for now. Just remember what we talked about. That evening, I met Sarah and Michelle at Cornerstone Coffee, a small cafe 3 blocks from the Meridian building where we'd established a routine of meeting after work to keep our personal lives completely separate from our professional obligations. It was a cozy place with exposed brick walls, mismatched furniture, and the kind of atmosphere that encouraged long conversations over steaming mugs of coffee. Sarah was already there when I arrived, sitting at our usual table in the back corner, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and her accounting files spread out in front of her. She looked up when I walked in, and I could see the concern in her brown eyes immediately. You look stressed, she said, closing her laptop and giving me her full attention. Rough day. Michelle arrived 5 minutes later, still wearing her marketing department blazer but having traded her heels for comfortable flats. She slid into the booth next to Sarah, and I noticed the subtle way they touched hands briefly. Despite the unconventional nature of our relationship, there was genuine affection between all of us. Derek pulled me into his office today, I told them, stirring sugar into my coffee and choosing my words carefully. He's getting suspicious about our interactions at work. Michelle's expression immediately became serious. She's always been the strategic thinker of our little group, the one who can see around corners and anticipate problems before they become crises. How suspicious exactly, she asked, her marketing training kicking in as she analyzed the situation like a campaign challenge. Suspicious and looked desperately around the room, searching for any sign of sympathy or support. But the accusations against me are false. I was following company policy. I was protecting Meridian's interests. Derek, I said calmly, the investigation into your management practices found clear evidence of policy violations, harassment of employees, and creation of hostile work environments. Your email doesn't change those findings, it confirms them. Janet pulled out a formal termination letter and placed it in front of Derek. Derek Chen, effective immediately, your employment with Meridian Solutions is terminated for cause. The specific violations include misrepresentation of company policy, harassment of employees, creation of hostile work environments, and violation of your employee agreement through today's company-wide email. Derek stared at the termination letter as if it were written in a foreign language. You can't do this. I've worked here for 3 years. I've maintained professional standards. I've protected this company's interests. You've systematically abused your authority to harass vulnerable employees, Patricia Williams said firmly. You've misrepresented company policy to serve your own agenda. And today, you've damaged company reputation through public accusations that are both false and defamatory. Derek's hand started shaking as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his denial. This is because of him, isn't it? He said, pointing at me. This is all because I tried to enforce policy with a temporary worker who has family connections. This is because you chose to escalate a manageable workplace situation into systematic harassment, policy violations, and ultimately corporate sabotage, Janet replied coldly. Jake Morrison's family connections are irrelevant to the documented evidence of your misconduct. Michael Chen placed a legal document next to Derek's termination letter. Derek, this is a cease and desist order regarding any further public statements about Meridian Solutions, its employees, or the circumstances of your termination. Violation of this order could result in legal action for defamation and interference with business operations. Derek picked up the cease and desist order with trembling hands. Legal action? You're threatening to sue me? We're protecting the company and its employees from further harassment and defamation, Patricia Williams clarified. Your email today demonstrated that you're willing to damage company reputation and employee morale to serve your personal agenda. Derek looked around the room one more time, and I could see the exact moment when he finally understood that his career at Meridian Solutions was irreversibly over. The authority he'd wielded, the power he'd exercised, the control he'd enjoyed, all of it was gone, stripped away by the consequences of his own actions. I want you to understand something, Derek, I said, standing up and straightening my tie. This didn't happen because I have family connections or because Janet played favorites. This happened because you systematically abused your authority to harass people you thought couldn't fight back. Derek's eyes filled with tears of rage and humiliation. You destroyed my career. No, Derek. You destroyed your career. I just documented what you did and reported it through proper channels. Every email you sent, every threat you made, every policy you violated, those were your choices, not mine. Janet gathered her papers and stood up. Derek, security will escort you from the building within the next 30 minutes. Your personal belongings will be packed and shipped to your home address. Your access to company systems has been revoked, and your company credit cards and equipment must be surrendered immediately. As we prepared to leave Derek's office for the final time, Patricia Williams turned back toward him. Derek, I want you to understand that the investigation into your management practices will continue even after your termination. Every employee you've harassed will have the opportunity to file formal complaints, and we'll be reviewing every employment action you've taken. Derek sat frozen in his chair, staring at the termination letter and cease and desist order as if they were artifacts from an alien civilization. The man who had spent months terrorizing temporary workers and permanent employees alike was finally facing the consequences of his systematic abuse of authority. Oh, and Derek? Janet said as we reached the door. The other employees you've been harassing, Jennifer Walsh, Robert Kim, Priya Patel, Marcus Williams, they'll all be receiving formal apologies from the company and appropriate compensation for the hostile work environment you created. Derek's face crumpled as he realized that not only was his own career over, but his victims would be receiving justice and vindication. The power structure he'd built through intimidation and harassment was being systematically dismantled and replaced with policies that actually protected employees. As we walked away from Derek's office, I could see other employees watching through the glass walls, clearly sensing that a significant change had just occurred in the department's leadership structure. Word of Derek's termination would spread quickly, and the atmosphere of fear and intimidation he'd created would begin to dissipate immediately. "Jake," Janet said as we reached the elevator bank, "I want you to know that what you did today took considerable courage. Most people in your situation would have just quit and found another job rather than fighting back against workplace harassment." "I couldn't let Derek continue targeting vulnerable people," I replied. Jennifer Walsh with her childcare challenges, Robert Kim struggling with technology, Priya Patel perfecting her English, they deserved better than Derek's abuse. Patricia Williams shook my hand firmly. "Jake, you've not only protected yourself and your relationships, but you've made this workplace safer for everyone. Derek's termination sends a clear message that harassment and abuse of authority will not be tolerated." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we implement policies to prevent future Derek Chens from abusing their authority," Michael Chen replied. "Mandatory management training, regular employee surveys, clear reporting channels for harassment, and oversight of supervisory actions." Janet checked her watch. "Jake, I know this has been an exhausting day, but I'd still like to discuss your future here at Meridian. Your HR background and the way you've handled this situation suggest you'd be valuable in a permanent position." As the elevator arrived, I could see Sarah and Michelle waiting in the lobby, both of them clearly anxious to hear the outcome of the day's events. In a few minutes, I'd be able to tell them that Derek's harassment campaign was not just over, but that it had backfired so spectacularly that Derek was now facing potential legal action for his abuse of authority. But first, I had one more thing to do. I turned back toward Derek's office, where I could see him through the glass walls, still sitting at his desk staring at his termination papers. Derek looked up as I approached his office door. His face was streaked with tears, and his expensive suit was wrinkled from stress. The man who had terrorized so many employees was now facing the complete destruction of his professional reputation and career prospects. "Jake," Derek said quietly, "I need you to understand something. I wasn't trying to be malicious. I thought I was protecting the company. I thought I was maintaining standards." I stood in his doorway, looking at this broken man who had caused so much suffering through his misguided pursuit of power and control. "Derek," I said calmly, "the problem wasn't your intentions. The problem was that you never bothered to understand the actual policies you were claiming to enforce. You created your own rules and then terrorized people for violating standards that didn't exist." Derek wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I made mistakes. I see that now. But did my entire career have to be destroyed? Did you have to take everything away from me?" "I didn't take anything away from you, Derek. You gave it away when you chose to escalate harassment instead of following proper procedures. Every email you sent, every threat you made, every humiliation session you conducted, those were your choices." Derek stared down at his desk, finally beginning to comprehend the scope of his professional downfall. "What am I supposed to do now? Who's going to hire me after this?" "That's not my problem to solve, Derek. But if you want some advice, start by actually reading employment policies before you try to enforce them. Learn the difference between management authority and personal power. And maybe consider that the people you supervise are human beings who deserve basic respect." Derek looked up at me one final time, and I could see in his eyes the exact moment when he finally understood who he'd been dealing with. Not just a temporary worker, but an HR professional with connections, documentation skills, and the knowledge to systematically dismantle his abuse of authority. "You played me from the beginning," Derek whispered. "No, Derek. I tried to do my job while maintaining my personal relationships according to actual company policy. You're the one who decided to turn it into a war. You just picked the wrong opponent. I turned to walk away, but Derek called after me one last time. Jake, what would you have done if I had just followed proper procedures from the beginning? If I had told you to file a disclosure form instead of threatening your job? I paused at his doorway and looked back. I would have filed the form, continued my work, and you never would have heard from me again. Sarah, Michelle, and I would have maintained our relationships according to company policy, and you'd still have your job. Derek's face crumpled as he realized how completely unnecessary his harassment campaign had been. I destroyed everything for nothing. Yes, Derek. You did. I walked away from Derek Chen for the final time, leaving him to contemplate the smoking ruins of a career he destroyed through his own arrogance, ignorance, and abuse of power. Security guards were already approaching his office to escort him from the building, and within the hour, Derek Chen would no longer be a Meridian Solutions employee. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, I felt a profound sense of completion. Derek's reign of terror was over, his victims were protected, and justice had been served through proper corporate channels with thorough documentation and legal oversight. But the most satisfying part wasn't Derek's downfall. It was knowing that tomorrow, Jennifer Walsh could arrive at work without fear of harassment about her childcare schedule. Robert Kim could ask for training support without risking public humiliation. Priya Patel could speak freely without criticism of her accent. And every temporary worker in the building could do their jobs without worrying about arbitrary enforcement of non-existent policies. I found Sarah and Michelle waiting by the elevator bank, both of them clearly anxious about the day's events. How did it go? Sarah asked immediately. Derek has been terminated for cause, I said simply. His harassment campaign backfired so spectacularly that he's now facing potential legal action for defamation and corporate sabotage. Michelle's eyes widened in amazement. He's actually gone. Just like that. Just like that. And his termination was entirely self-inflicted. If Derek had simply followed actual company policy instead of making up his own rules, none of this would have happened. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. I still can't believe you managed to turn this around so completely. This morning I was terrified of losing my job, and now Derek's the one being escorted out by security. The system worked exactly as it's supposed to, I replied. Document everything, build a case with witnesses, present evidence to people who understand employment law, and let the consequences unfold naturally. As we walked toward the parking garage together, no longer hiding our relationships or looking over our shoulders for surveillance, I reflected on the events that had brought us to this moment. Derek Chen had thought he could use his authority to intimidate and control people he considered powerless. Instead, he'd discovered that his victims weren't as vulnerable as he'd assumed, and that workplace bullies eventually face consequences for their actions. So what happens now? Michelle asked as we reached the parking garage. Now we go back to being normal employees in a normal workplace, I said. We file our disclosure paperwork, maintain our relationships according to actual company policy, and never have to worry about Derek Chen again. And Derek? Sarah asked. Derek gets to explain to future employers why he was terminated for cause from his last position. He gets to live with the consequences of systematically harassing employees and violating company policies. And he gets to learn that actions have consequences, even for middle managers who think they're untouchable. As we reached our cars, I looked back at the Meridian Solutions building where Derek Chen was probably being escorted out by security at that very moment. The man who had spent months making people's lives miserable was finally facing the professional reckoning that his behavior had earned. You know what the best part is? I said to Sarah and Michelle as we prepared to drive home together. Derek could have avoided all of this by simply reading the employee handbook and following actual company policy. His entire harassment campaign was based on policies that didn't exist. So he destroyed his own career for nothing, Michelle observed. Absolutely nothing, I confirmed. And in the process, he provided us with everything we needed to protect ourselves and every other employee he'd been targeting. As we drove away from Meridian Solutions, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal revenge. Derek Chen had been a workplace predator who used his authority to abuse vulnerable people. Now he was facing the consequences of his actions while his victims were finally free from his harassment and intimidation. Justice, properly served through documented evidence and legal channels, really is the most satisfying revenge of all. Especially when your opponent defeats himself through his own arrogance and stupidity. Derek Chen had learned the hard way that sometimes the person you're trying to intimidate knows exactly how to use the system against you. And sometimes, the temp worker you're harassing has connections, resources, and documentation skills that can end your career with surgical precision. As I pulled into the driveway of my apartment complex, I smiled at the thought of Derek Chen sitting in his car somewhere, probably still trying to figure out how a simple temp worker had managed to completely destroy his professional life in a single day. The answer, Derek, is that you picked the wrong target and underestimated your opponent. You thought you were dealing with someone powerless, but you were actually dealing with someone who knew exactly how to play the game better than you ever could. And now you get to live with the consequences while I go upstairs to celebrate with the two women who made this entire battle worth fighting. But as I reached my apartment door, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, assuming it was spam, but something made me check it. Text message, Jake, this is Derek. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need you to understand something. I've been sitting in my car for the past hour thinking about everything that happened today, and I finally understand what I did wrong. Not just the policy stuff, but the human stuff. I terrorized people because I was scared. Scared of not being important, scared of not being respected, scared of not being taken seriously. I turned that fear into cruelty, and I hurt people who didn't deserve it. I know this doesn't change anything, and I know you have no reason to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I finally get it. I was wrong about everything. Derek. I stared at the message for a long moment, processing this unexpected glimpse of self-awareness from someone who had spent months demonstrating complete lack of empathy or understanding. Part of me wanted to ignore the message entirely. Derek Chen had caused tremendous suffering for multiple people, and a single moment of clarity didn't erase months of systematic harassment and abuse. He'd earned his professional downfall through his own choices, and he didn't deserve sympathy or forgiveness just because he was finally experiencing consequences. But another part of me recognized something important in Derek's message. For the first time since I'd known him, Derek was taking actual responsibility for his actions rather than blaming others or making excuses. He was acknowledging that his behavior had been driven by personal insecurities rather than professional necessity. I showed the message to Sarah and Michelle when they arrived at my apartment a few minutes later. Wow, Michelle said after reading it. I never expected Derek to show that kind of self-awareness. He actually admitted that he was wrong. Too little, too late, Sarah replied firmly. Derek put us through weeks of harassment and intimidation. He threatened our jobs, created a hostile work environment, and made our lives miserable. One apologetic text message doesn't undo all of that damage. I agree, I said. Derek's moment of clarity doesn't change what he did or the consequences he's facing. But it does suggest that maybe he learned something from this experience. We spent the evening discussing the events of the day, processing the emotional roller coaster we'd all been through, and planning our future at Meridian Solutions now that Derek's harassment campaign was permanently over. The next morning brought confirmation that Derek's termination was final and that the investigation into his management practices would continue. Patricia Williams sent me an email updating me on the situation. Patricia's email, Jake, I wanted to update you on the Derek Chen situation. His termination for cause has been finalized, and he will not be eligible for rehire at Meridian Solutions. The investigation into his management practices has revealed additional policy violations and evidence of harassment targeting other employees. We'll be conducting individual meetings with everyone in his former department to ensure they have opportunities to report any inappropriate treatment they experienced. Additionally, we're implementing new management training requirements and employee feedback systems to prevent similar situations in the future. Thank you again for your courage in reporting this situation and for the thorough documentation you provided. Your actions have made this workplace safer for everyone. Patricia Williams, Director of Human Resources. Over the following weeks, the full scope of Derek's abuse of authority became clear as other employees came forward with their own stories of harassment and intimidation. Jennifer Walsh reported that Derek had denied her requests for flexible scheduling specifically because he wanted to demonstrate his power over single mothers. Robert Kim described multiple instances where Derek had publicly humiliated him for asking technology questions that Derek considered beneath his educational level. Priya Patel revealed that Derek had suggested her accent made her unsuitable for client-facing work, despite her job responsibilities having nothing to do with client interaction. Each revelation reinforced that Derek Chen had been a systematic abuser who used his authority to target anyone he perceived as vulnerable or different. His harassment campaign against me had been just one example of a much broader pattern of workplace bullying and discrimination. But the most satisfying development came 3 weeks after Derek's termination, when Janet Morrison offered me a permanent position as senior HR analyst with a substantial salary increase and comprehensive benefits package. "Jake," Janet said during our meeting, "the way you handled the Derek Chen situation demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical thinking, documentation skills, and ethical standards we need in our HR department. You didn't just protect yourself and your relationships, you protected an entire department from an abusive manager. I appreciate the offer, Janet. But I want to make sure this isn't just because we're family. This offer is based entirely on your qualifications and performance," Janet replied firmly. "The family connection helped me understand your character, but your professional skills are what make you valuable to this organization." I accepted the position, and within a month, I was working directly with Patricia Williams to implement new policies and training programs designed to prevent future Derek Chens from abusing their authority. We created clear reporting channels for harassment, mandatory management training on employment law and workplace respect, and regular employee surveys to identify problematic supervisors before they could cause significant damage. The most rewarding part of my new role was seeing the positive changes in workplace culture as Derek's reign of terror became a distant memory. Jennifer Walsh received approval for flexible scheduling and was promoted to senior data analyst. Robert Kim was provided with comprehensive technology training and became one of the department's most valuable contributors. Priya Patel was recognized for her analytical skills and offered opportunities for professional development that Derek had previously denied her. Even the temporary workers in the building benefited from the policy changes we implemented. Clear guidelines for supervisor behavior, regular check-ins with HR, and anonymous feedback systems created an environment where contract employees could focus on their work without fear of arbitrary harassment or policy violations. 6 months after Derek's termination, I received an unexpected email from him. He'd apparently found a new job at a smaller company, working in a non-supervisory role that didn't give him authority over other employees. Derek's email: "Jake, I hope you don't mind me reaching out, but I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about our conversation on my last day at Meridian. You were right about everything. I did destroy my career for nothing. I did choose harassment over proper procedures. And I did target people I thought couldn't fight back. The past 6 months have been the hardest of my professional life, but they've also taught me things about management and leadership that I should have learned years ago. I know I can never undo the damage I caused, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to be better. The new company I'm working for sent me to management training courses, and I'm learning about actual HR policies instead of making up my own rules. I still don't understand how you managed to document everything so thoroughly or how you knew exactly which policies I was violating, but I respect the way you handled the situation. You could have destroyed me personally, but you focused on protecting the people I was hurting. That took professionalism and integrity that I didn't have. I hope the changes you've implemented at Meridian prevent other managers from making the mistakes I made. And I hope Jennifer, Robert, Priya, and the others are getting the respect they deserved all along. Derek Chen." I forwarded Derek's email to Patricia Williams and Janet Morrison, both of whom were surprised by his apparent growth and self-reflection. "It's remarkable," Patricia said during our weekly team meeting. Derek seems to have actually learned from his mistakes rather than just blaming everyone else for his downfall. People can change, Janet observed. But only if they face real consequences for their actions and take responsibility for the damage they've caused. I never responded to Derek's email, because I felt that our story was already complete. Derek Chen had learned that workplace bullies eventually face consequences for their actions, and that the people they target aren't always as powerless as they appear. He discovered that authority without empathy becomes abuse, and that management positions require actual knowledge of policies rather than arbitrary enforcement of personal preferences. Most importantly, Derek had learned that sometimes the temp worker you're trying to intimidate has the skills, connections, and documentation abilities to end your career with surgical precision. As for Sarah, Michelle, and me, our relationships continued to flourish in an environment free from harassment and surveillance. We filed our disclosure paperwork, maintained professional boundaries at work, and enjoyed our personal time together without fear of arbitrary policy enforcement or workplace retaliation. The love triangle that had started this entire saga continued to work beautifully, with all three of us finding happiness in an unconventional arrangement that somehow made perfect sense for our personalities and needs. We'd survived Derek's harassment campaign together, and the experience had strengthened our bonds rather than destroying them. Looking back on the Derek Chen situation, I'm struck by how completely unnecessary the entire conflict had been. If Derek had simply asked me to file a disclosure form instead of threatening my job, if he had followed actual company policy instead of inventing his own rules, if he had treated people with basic respect instead of using his authority to intimidate and control, none of the drama would have occurred. Derek would still have his job, I would have remained a temporary worker, and the dozens of employees he harassed would never have experienced his abuse. Instead, Derek's insecurities and need for power led him to create a conflict that resulted in his own professional destruction and provided me with everything I needed to protect his victims. Sometimes the best revenge is simply allowing people to face the natural consequences of their own actions. Derek Chen defeated himself through his arrogance, ignorance, and abuse of authority. I just documented the process and reported it through proper channels. And in the end, justice prevailed through the very system Derek thought he could manipulate to serve his personal agenda. The policies he misrepresented were used against him, the authority he abused was stripped away, and the people he targeted were ultimately protected and vindicated. It's a perfect example of how workplace bullies often contain the seeds of their own destruction, and how the victims they underestimate sometimes have resources and capabilities they never imagined. Derek Chen learned this lesson the hard way, but at least he learned it. And his former victims learned that they don't have to accept harassment and abuse just because it comes from someone with a supervisor title. Most importantly, the entire organization learned that employees who document problems and report them through proper channels will be supported and protected, while managers who abuse their authority will face swift and decisive consequences. That's the kind of workplace culture worth fighting for, and worth protecting through careful documentation, strategic thinking, and the willingness to stand up to bullies who think their titles make them untouchable. Derek Chen discovered that sometimes they're very, very wrong about that. And I discovered that the most satisfying victories are the ones where your opponent defeats himself while you simply provide the documentation and legal framework for justice to unfold naturally. But the real ending to this story came exactly 1 year after Derek's termination, during Meridian Solutions' annual employee recognition ceremony. I was standing at the podium, having just received the company's Excellence in Employee Advocacy award for my work in HR and the policy changes we'd implemented. As I looked out at the audience of colleagues, I saw Jennifer Walsh in the front row, beaming with pride as she held her own award for Outstanding Performance in Data Analysis. Robert Kim was sitting next to her, having just been recognized for his innovative contributions to the company's new technology initiatives. Priya Patel was in the second row, wearing the confident smile of someone who'd recently been promoted to senior analyst and was thriving in her new role. Sarah and Michelle were both there, Sarah having been promoted to accounting supervisor and Michelle having launched a successful new marketing campaign that had increased company revenue by 22%. They were sitting together, no longer hiding their friendship or our relationships, in a workplace where authentic human connections were celebrated rather than punished. During my acceptance speech, I talked about the importance of creating workplaces where every employee feels safe, respected, and valued. I spoke about the courage it takes to report harassment and the responsibility we all have to protect vulnerable colleagues from abuse of authority. A year ago, I said to the assembled crowd, this company faced a choice between maintaining the status quo and implementing real change to protect employees from harassment and discrimination. Thanks to the leadership of Janet Morrison, Patricia Williams, and many others, we chose change. Today, Meridian Solutions is not just a more productive workplace, but a more humane one. As I concluded my remarks and returned to my seat, I felt a profound sense of completion. Derek Chen's harassment campaign had ultimately led to positive changes that protected hundreds of employees from future abuse. His victims had not only survived his tyranny but had thrived in its absence. And the workplace culture we'd built together was stronger, safer, and more successful than anything Derek's authoritarian management style could have achieved. After the ceremony, as Sarah, Michelle, and I walked to our cars together, Sarah posed a question that had been on all our minds. "Do you think Derek ever really understood what he did wrong?" she asked. "I think he understood that he hurt people," I replied. "Whether he truly comprehends the systematic nature of his abuse and the damage it caused, that's harder to say." "Does it matter?" Michelle asked. "Derek's gone, his victims are thriving, and the policies we implemented will prevent future Derek Chens from causing similar damage. The important thing is that justice was served and people were protected." As we reached our cars, I looked back at the Meridian Solutions building, where lights were still glowing in windows where dedicated employees were working late on projects they found meaningful and rewarding. It was a workplace where temporary workers could build relationships without fear, where permanent employees could ask questions without risking humiliation, and where management authority was balanced with accountability and respect for human dignity. Derek Chen had intended to use his position to control and intimidate people he considered beneath him. Instead, his abuse of authority had catalyzed changes that made Meridian Solutions a model workplace for employee protection and advocacy. In the end, Derek's greatest contribution to the company was teaching us, through his terrible example, exactly what kind of management behavior we would never tolerate again. Sometimes the best lessons come from the worst teachers. And sometimes the most satisfying justice is simply allowing people to face the natural consequences of their choices while ensuring that their victims are protected and empowered. Derek Chen learned that workplace bullies eventually face consequences for their actions. His victims learned that they don't have to accept harassment and abuse, even from people with impressive titles and authority. And everyone learned that sometimes the person you're trying to intimidate has exactly the right combination of knowledge, connections, and moral courage to turn your weapon against you. Game over, Derek. Lesson learned. Justice served. 2 years later, I received one final message from Derek Chen. Not an email this time, but a handwritten letter delivered by mail to my home address. The envelope was simple, with Derek's return address from a city 3 states away where he'd apparently relocated for a fresh start. Derek's handwritten letter: "Jake, I hope this letter finds you well and that you don't mind me writing to you one last time. I've been thinking about our conversation on my last day at Meridian for 2 years now, and I finally feel ready to say what I should have said then. I was wrong about everything. Not just the policies, not just the management techniques, but wrong about what it means to be a leader and what it means to be a human being in a workplace. I terrorized people because I was afraid of being exposed as incompetent, and I turned that fear into cruelty toward people who didn't deserve it. I know now that real leadership means protecting vulnerable people, not targeting them. It means understanding policies before enforcing them, not making up rules to serve your own ego. And it means creating environments where people can thrive, not environments where they live in fear. I've spent the past 2 years in therapy, taking management courses, and working in positions where I don't have authority over other people. I'm learning to be the kind of person I should have been all along, but it's hard work to undo decades of thinking that power meant the right to control and intimidate others. I saw an article online about Meridian Solutions winning an award for workplace culture and employee advocacy. The article mentioned your work in HR and the policy changes that have made the company a model for other organizations. I'm genuinely happy that my mistakes led to something positive, even though I know that doesn't erase the harm I caused. I wanted you to know that I think about Jennifer Walsh, Robert Kim, Priya Patel, Marcus Williams, and all the other people I hurt through my arrogance and cruelty. I hope they're thriving now in ways that my toxic management would never have allowed. And I wanted you to know that I understand now why you documented everything so carefully and why you reported my behavior through proper channels rather than just quitting. You were protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, and you were ensuring that my abuse of authority would have consequences. That took courage and integrity that I didn't possess. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't expect a response to this letter. I just wanted you to know that the lessons you taught me about accountability, empathy, and the proper use of authority have changed my life in ways that I'm still discovering. Thank you for stopping me before I could hurt more people, and thank you for turning my failure into something that protects others. I hope I never have the opportunity to manage people again, because I finally understand that authority is a privilege that must be earned through service to others, not a weapon to be used against them. Respectfully, Derek Chen. I read Derek's letter twice, then showed it to Sarah and Michelle over dinner that evening. The three of us had been married for 6 months, all three of us to each other, in a ceremony that celebrated our unconventional but deeply loving relationship. He really has changed, Michelle observed after reading the letter. This doesn't sound like the same person who terrorized half the office and sent the company-wide email blaming everyone else for his problems. People can change, Sarah agreed. But only if they face real consequences and do the hard work of understanding what they did wrong. Derek apparently did both. I'm glad he's learned from his mistakes, I said. But I'm even more glad that his victims were protected and that the changes we implemented will prevent future Derek Chens from causing similar damage. The next morning, I shared Derek's letter with Janet Morrison and Patricia Williams during our quarterly HR policy review meeting. Both of them were surprised by the depth of Derek's apparent transformation and self-reflection. It's remarkable, Janet said. Derek seems to have genuinely understood not just what he did wrong, but why it was wrong and how it affected other people. The therapy and management training apparently helped, Patricia observed. But the real change came from facing consequences for his actions and being held accountable for the damage he caused. What's most important, I added, is that Derek's story serves as a powerful example of why we need strong policies and accountability measures. Workplace bullies need to face swift and decisive consequences, not just for their own development, but to protect their victims. As we continued our policy review meeting, I reflected on how completely the Derek Chen situation had transformed not just individual lives, but an entire organizational culture. What had started as one manager's abuse of authority had catalyzed changes that now protected hundreds of employees and served as a model for other companies. Jennifer Walsh was now Director of Data Analytics, leading a team of 12 people with the kind of empathetic management style that Derek had never possessed. Robert Kim had become the company's leading expert on technology integration, sharing his knowledge freely and mentoring younger employees with patience and respect. Priya Patel was a senior consultant who traveled nationally to help other companies implement the diversity and inclusion policies that Meridian had pioneered. Each of Derek's former victims had not only recovered from his harassment but had flourished in ways that demonstrated the human potential he had tried to crush through his authoritarian management style. The most satisfying aspect of the entire situation was knowing that Derek's legacy at Meridian Solutions wasn't his abuse of authority, but the policies and cultural changes that had been implemented to prevent future abuse. His failure had become the foundation for a workplace where every employee could thrive without fear of harassment or discrimination. 3 years after Derek's termination, Meridian Solutions was featured in a Harvard Business Review case study about transforming toxic workplace cultures through policy innovation and employee advocacy. The article highlighted the comprehensive approach we taken to address not just individual bad actors, but the systemic issues that allow workplace harassment to flourish. I was interviewed for the article, and when asked about the Derek Chen situation, I focused not on his individual failures but on the importance of creating systems that protect vulnerable employees and hold managers accountable for their actions. Workplace harassment isn't just about individual bad actors, I told the Harvard Business Review reporter. It's about organizational cultures that fail to protect employees and accountability systems that allow abuse to continue unchecked. Real change requires comprehensive policy reform, management training, and the courage to face difficult truths about how power dynamics can be used to harm rather than help. The article concluded with a simple but powerful observation: sometimes the most transformative changes come from the most difficult challenges, and sometimes the people who try to destroy others end up catalyzing the very changes that protect future victims. Derek Chen had set out to intimidate and control a temporary worker he considered beneath his authority. Instead, he had triggered a series of events that would protect countless employees for decades to come. In the end, Derek's greatest contribution to workplace culture wasn't his management techniques or his policy interpretations. It was serving as a perfect example of everything a leader should never be, and inspiring the creation of systems designed to ensure that future employees would never have to endure what his victims had suffered. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who show us exactly what not to do. And sometimes the most lasting victories are the ones that transform individual suffering into systemic protection for others. Derek Chen learned that actions have consequences, even for people with authority and impressive titles. His victims learned that they have power to fight back against harassment and abuse. And everyone learned that workplace cultures can be transformed when people have the courage to document problems, report abuse, and demand better treatment for vulnerable colleagues. The temp worker Derek tried to intimidate had become the architect of policies that would protect employees long after both of us had moved on to other challenges. And the manager who thought his authority gave him the right to terrorize others had learned that real leadership means using power to protect and empower people, not to control and diminish them. Game over, Derek. But in the end, everyone won except the toxic behaviors you represented. And that's exactly how justice should work.